Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our second talk of 2025, where we have Dimitri Coelho Mollo coming from Umeå in icy, dark Sweden, where he presently works on the philosophy of AI and is also an area lead for a center on a transdisciplinary center on AI that you have there. Uh, Dimitri started off at the world's oldest university in Bologna with a BA and an MA in philosophy, which he followed with a PhD in philosophy at King's, jointly at the same time at the Humboldt University in Berlin. The parts of his work that I know best that are to do with AI are his work on internal representation and meaning, which is great and which I heartily recommend. I don't know what's going to be up with functional ontologies for explainable AI, but I look forward to finding out. So over to you, Dimitri.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ulrike, for the invitation and for the kind introduction. Indeed, I'm not going to be talking about representations all that much today, but I'm going to be talking about computations and algorithms and internal states of especially large language models. So there is some connection to that previous work of mine. All right, so the plan for today is the following. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about how philosophy of AI, but also AI in cognitive science, has been changing roles recently from being tools to being research targets themselves to a larger extent than they were during the previous waves of connectionism, especially. Then I'm going to focus on large language models as targets of research for not only AI but also cognitive science. Then I'm going to introduce the idea of cognitive ontologies in cognitive science and of functional ontologies in AI. And I'm going to illustrate this with some examples coming from work from a previous speaker here in this seminar series, namely Eli Pavlek, work coming from her lab at least. All right, so let's start with this sort of distinction, which is color-coded in the following slides, between AI as research tool in blue and AI as research target in green. And here my focus is especially in AI in philosophy and cognitive science and how they see AI, as I mentioned. So of course, as you certainly know, there are decades of interaction and mutual interest between philosophers, cognitive scientists, and AI researchers. So there has always been a sort of intermingling between these different disciplines. And for example, when it comes to philosophy and cognitive science, questions that have been asked that were relevant or for which work on AI has been relevant historically are questions such as what is the right architecture for cognition, what is and can be learned, and what is innate, understood and non-learned. And here we had some connections to the classical debates in AI between different approaches, such as symbolicism, connectionism, and embodied cognition that have their sorts of counterparts in cognitive science and philosophy of cognitive science as well. And then we have also questions that have been asked about the nature of AI systems more specifically, such as, can they be intelligent at all? If so, what would be required for them to count as intelligent? Can they be conscious? What would be required for them to come to be conscious? So these were more questions that were more strongly asked within philosophy, especially speculative philosophy. But in philosophy of science and philosophy of cognitive science, we also have questions such as, well, what's the nature of AI models? What roles can they play in science? Can they be explanatory? For example, do predictive models that use, say, artificial neural networks, are they explanatory? Are they just predictive? What makes them one or the other? Then are AI models of cognitive, cognitive capacities rather than something else? Are AI models of brain function? For example, this has been discussed quite a bit in connection to large language models. So do they model the computations and representations? Do they model the at least part of the language functions in human brains? So work by F. Fedorenko, for example, has been dedicated to this question. Now, in light of the recent increase in capabilities of AI models due to the third wave of connectionism that started around 2012 in various areas, such as visual processing, language translation, and of course, generative AI in its various forms, has led to a move, to a certain extent, from seeing AI systems only as tools for research and to seeing them as also targets. So targets for our attempts at explaining and understanding how it is that they are able to do these things, right? So they become explanatory targets in their own rights. So we can ask questions such as, how do convolutional neural networks work? Or image generation models or large language models? And then we can ask the further question, how can we compare, if at all, AI capabilities with biological capabilities in light of the many differences between the systems, or at least, apparent strong differences between the systems, such as different learning regimens, different data that is used, the different algorithms, heuristics, and of course, the behavioral patterns of success and error that they show nowadays. So what can they tell us about AI capabilities and cognitive capabilities and how they work and so on and so forth? So my focus, as I mentioned, is going to be on large language models as targets of research. So asking exactly this question, well, how do they work? How are they able to do what they are able to do, and what it is that they are able to do? So how can we individuate or identify the capacities that they actually display in their performance? So a very popular approach when it comes to trying to understand which capabilities AI systems have, and among them large language models, is benchmarking. So the idea here is that we create, several benchmarks that are supposed to probe a certain specific task, or rather to be a certain specific task that probes a certain capacity, and see how they perform in those benchmarks. And we can use these benchmarks at least in two different ways. So one is to try and study the reliability of AI applications in and across different tasks. So for example, if we are interested in putting an AI system out there in the world for a certain practical purpose, we can use a benchmark to try and see whether it is going to be reliable enough or successful enough at that or those tasks we are interested in. But we can also use performance in these benchmarks to try and understand the capabilities and limitations of AI systems, right? So we can do a sort of behavioral psychology, if you wish, of the systems if we are careful enough in the design of our benchmarks, right? So we can have, for example, benchmarks that are very similar to each other, but that show differential performance, and then we can ask or put forward hypotheses for why there is this difference between performance in those benchmarks. However, there are also limits with benchmarks, namely they are purely behavioral, so they don't give us insights, if not of a very indirect kind, under the hood. So what computations and representations are actually being used by the system. And there is also an issue about whether the way we understand the task that we create in the benchmark is appropriate to what the system is actually doing, right? So there is an issue with sort of automatically thinking that a task that in a human probes for a certain capacity, in a system that is very unlike a human, like a large language model, is also going to probe for that capacity, right? So that's a problematic assumption that is often made. So the fact that intuitively, or for a human, it seems that a certain task would involve a certain capacity does not entail that an LLM, say, or another AI system is going to solve that task by means of displaying a similar or implementing a similar capacity. So that's another limitation or issue here. And of course, there is a related problem that, in light of what I just said, it may be tricky to generalize from one task to another, especially given these differences. For example, there is nice work by McCoy and al. From last year, late last year actually, when it was published, in which they show that LLMs show very different performance in what seem to be identical tasks to a human, right? And then it opens a question, well, if I see very successful performance in this task, in a human, I would think, or I'd infer, well, therefore the human is also going to have very good performance in these other tasks that are closely related to that one. But it turns out that that inference is also problematic when it comes to AI systems. Another popular approach that has been growing in popularity, especially in the past few years, is what is known as mechanistic interpretability. So the focus here, instead of being on the behavior, is on the mechanistic functioning of the AI systems. So we can ask questions like, well, how may large language models do variable binding? How may they do syntactic and semantic composition? And the answers we are looking for are going to be in terms of algorithms and representations internal to the system. So it can be useful for explaining the mechanistic workings and therefore also the limitations of systems like LLMs. But given the complexity of the systems, it ends up being only applicable to toy models, or rather small models, even though I'm going to show an exception to this later on. And there is a worry that their generalization powers are also limited, because what may apply in a toy model, in a small, say, transformer, may not apply in a bigger one, right? So the light that is shed by looking at simple models might not be much when we look at larger models, for example. So what I'm going to suggest here is that there is a missing link in our attempts to try and understand systems like large language models. So benchmarks investigate behavioral performance, mechanistic interpretability investigates the computational and representational building blocks. But we are missing a way of connecting performance to mechanism in a way that can allow us to look under the hood, but still keep to some abstract theory about the systems, such that we can generalize across different systems. And here my suggestion is to take, some lessons from cognitive science, especially from cognitive comparative psychology, when we see this sort, again, this is a sort of simplification, but this sort of theoretical separation between and mutual connection between different categories. So we have tasks and task performance on one side, we have neural implementation on the other, but in between, we have cognitive functions, right, that we posit to explain task performance and that are implemented by, neural goings on that we are still investigating. The question, though, is what are the right categories for these? So what are the right categories to talk about tasks? What are the right categories for cognitive functions? What are the right categories for neural implementation? So for example, in neural implementation, we can talk about, areas, we can talk about circuits, we can talk about networks. So what are the right units, so to speak, that we should use there? In other words, what are the right ontologies for each one of these theoretical domains? in cognitive science. So this is the motivation behind what is known in cognitive science and philosophy as the cognitive ontology research, debate. So it started by Price and Friston in 2005, if I recall correctly, as a way to try and figure out how to map cognitive functions into neural structures, but then evolved partially because of philosophers into broader questions about what the right ontologies for cognitive science are across those different domains and how these ontologies relate to each other. So how do the cognitive functions that we posit relate to the units of neural implementation that we posit and to the task ontologies that we use in our experiments, for example. So we ask questions as what cognitive functions are there, what kinds of cognitive tasks, and so on and so forth. So we end up with something like this. For example, in the case of memory, we can have like a cognitive task of interest. Sorry, a cognitive function of interest might be working memory. And then we have specific tasks that are supposed to probe the capacity or the function of working memory, such as memory span tests. And we can look at possible neural implementations, for example, in this case, in prefrontal and parietal cortex. But we can also understand neural implementation in a different way, more abstract way, in terms of computations. So computations C in prefrontal cortex, say. So my suggestion is that we should have a same sort of theoretical structure when it comes to trying to understand AI systems. So we have benchmark tests on one side, we have mechanistic implementation on the other side, but we need something in between that does the mediating role that cognitive functions play when it comes to cognitive science. And that's going to be my proposal here, namely that we need functional ontologies for AI. Why functional and not cognitive? Well, because I don't want to, assume too much. There are different views about what counts as cognition, and I don't want, to pre-decide these questions or, buy into controversial views that I don't need to buy into. So instead of using the term cognitive ontology, I'm just going to use the term functional ontology. That is less, has less baggage, I think. Still has some baggage, but less baggage, I think. So the proposal is that, the sort of theoretical structure of our attempts at understanding systems like large language models should have a sort of mirror structure, having mechanistic implementation on one side, benchmark tests on the other side, and functional ontologies doing the mediating work between the two, and thus allowing some generalization as well by abstracting away from mechanistic implementation and by allowing, for example, the explanation of different tasks or performance in different tasks by means of the same functional characterization. So we can ask questions when it comes to AI systems, such as what functions are there, say, in a transformer architecture? What kinds of tasks can the system solve, and are the systems solving when we put forward some test? And how does a task relate to specific functional characterizations, right? So can a task be solved by different functional means? Do different tasks, or are different tasks solved by the same functional means, and so on and so forth? And then we can ask, well, what are the right functional categories for implementation? So what sorts of components, mechanistic components, should we attach to cognitive functions? One thing to keep in mind is that it's likely that the answers to these questions are going to be specific to specific AI architectures, right? So it's very unlikely, I think, that we're going to find that functional ontologies that apply very well to the transformer architecture are also going to apply very well to, say, convolution neural networks. So I think these questions need to be investigated in a architecture-specific way. But perhaps there are some, general things that apply across architectures. I don't want to take a position on that. So now, for pretty much the rest of this talk, I'm going to go into a case study that, as I mentioned at the beginning, is work that has been carried out by Eli Pavlik's lab, in which they look at two tasks: indirect object identification and object color matching in GPT-2 medium, which is not a toy model, it's not a particularly small model, but still quite small. So this is the paper, Merullo and others, 2024. I think it's still in preprint phase. So what is the indirect object identification task? So it's something like this. Then Matthew and Robert had a lot of fun at the school. Robert gave a ring to, and the LLM has to complete with in this case, the correct answer would be, or the correct completion would be Matthew. In the object color matching task, we have tasks such as on the table, there is a blue pencil, a black necklace, and a yellow lighter. What color is the pencil? Answer, and then the LLM is supposed to complete the sequence with the answer to the question, in this case, blue. So interestingly, they tested GPT-2 medium on these two tasks, and they found that it performed extremely well in the first one, and it didn't perform so well in the second one. However, as I'm going to mention later, by tweaking a little bit the network, they were able to reach a performance in the second task of 93%, actually. And I'm going to show you why and why this is interesting for our purposes. So here's a reconstruction of the algorithm that Merullo and all theorize or hypothesize is going on in GPT-2 medium when it is solving the indirect object identification task. So the first step would be detect duplicate tokens. Inhibit the tokens that are duplicated, right? Because you don't want to repeat the same name, in this case of person, right? Robert, Matthew, and so on. You don't want three Roberts, right? You want Roberts to have given the ring to Matthew and not to himself. Ignore inhibited names, attend to the remaining name, right? So you see, well, there are two names, Robert, three names, Robert, Matthew, Robert, right? So you find, well, Robert appears twice, you ignore Matthew, you attend to Robert, and you move the remaining name, namely Matthew, to the output slot. So to visualize this a bit better, so you detect duplicate tokens, and Merullo and all finds a specific attention heads doing this work, which they call the duplicate token heads in this paper. Then you inhibit the tokens that are duplicated through inhibition heads and negative mover heads, so that Robert becomes inhibited, that token, or the tokens that are tied to Robert are inhibited. Then you ignore the inhibited names, right? So you don't consider Robert anymore. You attend to the remaining name. This again, they find that token mover heads are doing this work. And then finally, you move the remaining name to the output slots. And they find that there are specific attention heads called token mover heads that seem to be doing that work. So this would explain how come, they are able to solve this task, right? And complete correctly the sentence with Robert gave a ring to Matthew. Now, when it comes to color matching, so to recall, this is the task. On the table, there is a blue pencil, a black necklace, and a yellow lighter. What color is the pencil? Answer. As I mentioned, the original network doesn't do so well, right, with a performance of around 50%. But what Merullo and all do here is they tweak the network such that it behaves in a similar way than it does with the other task, the indirect object identification task. So they make and this is a sort of my reconstruction that I'm a bit less confident in, but I think captures what's going on in the network quite well, according to those researchers. So again, you detect duplicate tokens, you find the target of the question, then we enhance the tokens that are relevant to the target of the question. You inhibit the tokens that are not relevant, in this case, color tokens that are not relevant. You attend to the color token that has not been inhibited, and then you move that token to the output slot. So in more detail, what we're going to have is something like that. So when you detect duplicate tokens by means of duplicate induction token heads, you see, or the network detects that there are two instances of pencil. Then content gatherer heads, they attend from the end of the input sequence. In this case, so the attention is going to be especially on when pencil appears the second time next to the tokens that form the word color. And so you have, the content gatherer heads sort of identifying the topic of the question in terms of color and pencil, right, which are at the end of the input sequence and just before the interrogation mark. Then you enhance the relevant token. So we see pencil twice. We know that we need the color of the pencil, right? And so induction heads already and duplicate heads already enhance the signal for the token that is connected to the color here of the pencil. And here's the big modification that they do in relation to the original network. Namely, they make it so that inhibition heads work better in this version, such that are able to inhibit the other color tokens in the input sequence. So in this case, the sort of attention value of black and yellow is diminished, making it so that the attention value of blue is much higher. Right? And since we know, or the content gatherer heads have sent a signal that what matters is color, then token mover heads attend to all color tokens and then select the color token that is strongest in the sense of most strongly attended to, and this is blue. Leading to the answer, correct answer in this case, that the answer here is blue, right? The pencil is blue. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, there is something interesting that Merullo and all notice, which is that for both tasks, there seems to be a very similar circuit involved, even without the improved version that I just presented for the color task. So both circuits involve a same general process I'm quoting from the paper, detecting a duplication and using that duplication to decide which token to copy into the output token. So in the colored objects task, the duplication is used as a positive signal, right? So if pencil appears twice, then it's positive. So you should attend to pencil and everything that is connected to it, such as its color, such that you tell the attention heads that do the copying which token to copy, in this case blue, right, from the input sequence. While in the indirect object identification task, the duplication sends a negative signal, right? So if Robert appears twice, you want to inhibit Robert and choose the other name in the input sequence, namely Matthew. And they do this via the inhibition heads, right? Telling, therefore, the copying heads, the mover heads, which tokens should ignore when they are supposed to copy contents into the output token. So one way to understand this in connection to what I've been talking about in terms of functional ontologies is the following. So we have a benchmark task, in this case, two different benchmark tasks, right? The indirect object identification task and the object color matching task. And we can see that they seem to be, that the LLM seems to be using the same sort of abstract algorithm circuit to solve those two apparently very different tasks. Namely, they are using systems such as duplicate, inhibition, and mover heads to allow them to select the relevant token in the input sequence among alternatives, right? So in the case of the first of the indirect objects identification task, there were Robert and Matthew, which were good candidates for continuation. And the system uses these specific attention heads, specialized attention heads, to select the appropriate one between Robert and Matthew, in this case, Matthew. Similarly with the object color matching task, right? I don't remember the colors anymore. I think it was blue, yellow, and black, right? And then it has to pick blue as the correct answer, right? So it has to copy the right token there as well, out of different good candidates for that, which were the other color tokens. And as much as we can talk at the level of implementation, we can take a more abstract or functional description in terms of, in this case, computational components such as duplicate, inhibition, induction, and mover heads. We can also take a closer look, which Merula and all do, and identify the specific attention heads, where they are, and what they are doing. So, for example, they identify mover heads and induction heads by, in this case, so we have layer 15, head 14, and so on and so forth, and they can say what they are contributing specifically to the algorithm, right? So this would be a little bit akin to when we talk about certain neural circuits doing something at the level of neural computations. Right? So I think this gives us at least a sort of example of what, work on functional ontologies can do and how it can be done when it comes to LLMs. Merula and all don't talk about this in terms of functional ontologies, of course, but they do recognize, and it's part of the thrust for the paper, exactly to try and find out these more abstract levels of description, right? That, for example, if you have this abstract circuit and that's your hypothesis about how the system can solve certain tasks, it can be implemented in different ways, right? By different sorts of systems with different number of layers, with the attention heads in different places. And indeed, when it comes to the indirect object identification task, what is interesting is that that same sort of circuit is also found in a different network on GPT-Mollo, right? So So they are also able to find, well, look, there is this circuit, or at least a very close approximation of this circuit in different LLMs, right? So it generalizes across different systems. And another thing that is interesting is that they find that a circuit, the same circuit, functionally understood, is involved in more than one task. Right? So it seems that functional capacities explain benchmark performance, right? Or they can explain benchmark performance, for example, in terms of implementing a certain abstract circuit, such as the one I presented earlier, that sort of listed algorithm. They are more abstract, and therefore they are more generalizable, as I mentioned, across different large language models or transformer architectures in this case, and across different tasks. And we have multiple realizability. This is mostly for the philosophers here, in several directions, right? So we have different functional capacities that may lead to the same benchmark success. We can have different mechanistic implementation that leads to the same functional capacity. For example, as it's likely the case in between GPT-2 small and GPT-2 medium, for example. And we can have different benchmark successes that depend on the same functional capacity, right? For example, it might be that, so, and this is an example that Merullo and all consider, so they think that the reason why the original GPT medium network network does not succeed or does not do so well in the color object matching task is because there are bottleneck effects because of the size of the network. So even though it has what it takes and it has the right circuit, because of bottleneck effects, that circuit does not work as efficiently as it could. And once you tweak the circuit such that it works better, then you get a much better performance. So we can also try and see, well, to what extent is this functional capacity working as it should in order to solve that task, and that may lead to differential benchmark successes. So my claim is that functional ontologies can be seen as the missing link between benchmarking and mechanistic interpretability work. But of course, there is no explanatory independence, right, between any of these theoretical domains, right? Differential performance suggests functional differences, as it does in behavioral psychology. And then we can talk about, for example, or exemplify this by means of looking at the color object matching performance with and without inhibition heads. So with or without the improved version that they created. And of course, implementation constrains functional capacity. So things like bottleneck effects and the sorts of attention heads, for example, specialized attention heads that the systems can generate. Now, one thing that is important to point out is that this work seems to suggest, interestingly, I think, that the function being employed here is this rather generic relevant token selection function, right? So it seems that what is going on here need not be characterized in terms of actually identifying the indirect objects or doing object color matching, right? In the sense of recognize that these things are colors, recognize that these things are objects, and then match the right ones, right? The mechanism is only a mechanism of selecting the right token or tokens in light of the duplication in the input sequence, mostly, right? So this gives us at least some reason to believe that at least the intuitive functions that we might ascribe to the systems might not be the best ones to characterize what is going on. All right, so just to conclude, I'm running out of time. So I've argued or presented the idea that AI systems nowadays are both research tools, which has been the familiar role in the past, but also ever more so research objects as well. So objects that we are interested in trying to understand better. And as objects, I think when we try to do research on them, it can be helpful to appeal to functional ontologies as much as it is helpful to appeal to cognitive ontologies when we are working on cognitive psychology. Different ontologies may apply to different kinds of systems, and it is risky to rely on human categories and our intuitions when informing our hypotheses about what's going on in the systems, given their many differences to humans. And I try to illustrate one such case with the function of relevant token copying. And of course, we can then go back to seeing this as a tool to try and better understand cognition itself, right? So we can think about, the functional ontologies that we find in AI systems as possible ontologies that intelligent systems may implement to solve a certain task, which may be quite different from the ontologies that humans and other biological systems use to tackle the tasks they are confronted with. So this leads to another point that I make in a different paper, that AI can also play this role of the exploration of possible intelligence space. And so it can be, understanding, so AI tools as research objects can work, AI systems as research objects can be helpful tools as well for us to explore the space of possible intelligent systems and their ontologies, and therefore help also to shed light on the nature of cognition, intelligence, and so forth, and the various forms that it can take. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention.